Lawrence Friedman, published by Oxford. Chapter 12 is called Nuclear Games, and there's a section called The New Strategist. By his own career, Brodie defined the possibility of a field of strategy in which civilians took the lead. He already had a low opinion of the quality of military thinking and made little effort to hide this, and regretted the extent to which the study of war had lagged behind other fields of human activity. Quote, "The purpose of soldiers is obviously not to produce books," end quote, he remarked in a 1949 article. Quote, "But one must assume that any real ferment of thought could not have so completely avoided breaking into print," end quote. Military training, he suggested, discouraged contemplation, was anti-intellectual, and focused excessively on practical matters and command issues. To the extent strategy was discussed, it was with reference to the supposedly unchanging principles of war along the lines first set down by Jomini. These were at best a pointed injunction to use common sense. With military problems growing not only in complexity but also in the potential for utter disaster, Brodie insisted that strategy needed to be taken altogether more seriously. As an example of how this might be done, he pointed to economics. Just as the economist sought to utilize the total resources of the nation to maximize its wealth, the strategist sought to use the same resources to maximize the total effectiveness of the nation in war. As all military problems were about economy of means, a, quote, "substantial part of classical economic theory is directly applicable to problems of military strategy," end quote. In particular, a science like economics could show the way to a genuine analytical method. The idea that the resolution of strategic problems depended on intellect and analysis rather than character and intuition fit in with the trend to subject all human decisions to the dictates of rationality and the application of science. It was given more urgency by the potentially catastrophic consequences of misjudgment in the nuclear age. The scientific method, as a means of interpreting large amounts of disparate data, had proved itself in Britain in the Second World War. It first made a mark when used to determine the best way to employ radar in air defense. As one of the key figures in the British program noted, the methodology used was closer to classical economics than physics, although economists were not directly engaged. During the course of the war, operations research, as the new field came to be known, made major strides in support of actual operations, including working out the safest arrangement for convoys in the face of submarine attack or choosing targets for air raids. Mathematicians and physicists made more of an impact in the United States, notably those who became involved in the Manhattan Project, the organization which had led to the production of the first atomic bomb. The center for the post-war application of such methods to practical and particularly military problems was the RAND Corporation, which became the prototypical think tank. The organization was set up under an Air Force grant to develop operational research. It soon became an independent nonprofit corporation addressing defense issues and other aspects of public policy using advanced analytical techniques. RAND began by recruiting natural scientists and engineers who expected to deal with hardware. Sharon Gamari Tabrizi describes RAND as fashioning itself as a Cold War avant-garde, self-consciously exploratory and experimental, with an insouciant disregard for traditional forms of military experience. Soon it was hiring economists and other social scientists. The steady improvements in computational power made mathematical approaches to complex problems more practical. Even economics up to this point had been more literate than numerate. Now quantitative analyses grew in strength and credibility. It is hard to overstate the importance of RAND, especially during its early years, in transforming established patterns of thought, not only in the military sphere but throughout the social sciences. The resources and tools it had available, including the most advanced computers of the day, provided it with a capacity to innovate, which it did with a remarkable sense of mission and confidence. The new universe that was explored at RAND was simulated as much as observed. Philip Mirowski described what he calls the cyborg sciences, These reflected the new interactions between men and machines. They broke down the distinctions between nature and society, as models of one begin to resemble the other, and between reality and simulacra. The Monte Carlo simulations adopted for dealing with uncertainty in data during the Manhattan Project, for example, opened up a range of possible experiments to explore the logic of complex systems, discerning ways through uncertainty and forms of order and chaos. Rand analysts saw these new methods as supplanting rather than supplementing traditional patterns of thought. Simple forms of cause and effect could be left behind as it became possible to explore the character of dynamic systems with the constantly changing interaction between component parts. The models of systems more or less orderly and stable that had started to become fashionable before the war could take on new meanings. And even in areas where intense computation was not required, there was a growing comfort in scientific circles, both natural and social, with models that were formal and abstract, not just based on direct observations of a narrow segment of accessible reality, but on explorations of something that approximated to a much larger and otherwise inaccessible reality. Types of systems and relationships could be analyzed in ways that the human mind, left on its own, could not begin to imagine. As one of the first textbooks on operations research noted, work of this sort required an, quote, impersonal curiosity concerning new subjects, end quote, rejection of unsupported statements, and a desire to rest decisions on some quantitative basis, even if the basis is only a rough estimate. Although this approach started with a focus on problems of national defense, its most far-reaching impact was elsewhere. Because in the military, particularly the nuclear sphere, there were practical and consequential decisions to be taken, the research and analysis had to remain grounded in evidence even when it was conceptually innovative. When faced with the possibility of nuclear war, an event for which there could be neither precedent nor experiment, and which in its enormity challenged imagination, only simulation was possible. In areas which seemed to be wholly unique, how many nuclear wars have you fought, General? Experience counted for less than a sharp and disciplined intellect. When in 1961, Hedley Bull, a young Australian with a skeptical but discerning eye, considered the state of strategic thought, he observed how much of it assumed the rational action of a kind of strategic man. This man, Bull observed on further acquaintance, reveals himself as a university professor of unusual intellectual subtlety. The reason for the ascent of strategic man, he suggested, was nuclear weapons. Strategy could no longer be solely concerned with how to fight war as an instrument of policy, but also had to understand how to threaten war. Studies of actual violence had to be supplemented by discussions of deterrence and the manipulation of risk. It was because of this that strategic thinking was no longer a military preserve. Civilian experts, Bull noted, overwhelmed the military with their publications and were the obvious people to consult on questions of deterrence and arms control. Now that John F. Kennedy had become president, civilian strategists had entered the citadels of power and have prevailed over military advisors in major issues of policy. Quote, end quote. Neither the military nor the civilians had any experience of the conduct of a nuclear war, so inevitably much strategic thinking was of an abstract and speculative character, which suited the civilians. They demonstrated sophistication and high intellectual quality in their work. The key people in this new approach had largely come from Rand. They were led at the Pentagon by a Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, who had pioneered the use of quantitative analysis while at the Ford Motor Company. He challenged the armed services to justify their budgets and programs in the face of intensive questioning. His agents in this were young analysts gathered in the Office of Systems Analysis. They were smart, brash, confident, and dismissive of the faltering attempts of military officers to block their ascent. McNamara's right-hand man in the Pentagon, Charles Hitch, who was recruited from Rand, had observed with a colleague in 1960, quote, essentially we regard all military problems as, in one of their aspects, economic problems in the efficient allocation and use of resources, end quote. McNamara demanded data and insisted on quantitative analysis as the best way to assess the costs and benefits of alternative programs. Disregarding the preference of the armed services, McNamara canceled favored programs and challenged cherished beliefs. It became a truism that McNamara's methods were inappropriate for fighting a war, especially one as politically complex as Vietnam, and failure here sullied his reputation forever. Yet for the first part of his tenure in the Pentagon, McNamara was considered to be the most gifted and effective member of the cabinets of Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson. The military floundered in his presence, looking amateurish even when discussing operational issues. McNamara was described as an IBM on legs. Decisive and articulate, he was the epitome of the rational strategic man in his mastery of the evidence and analytical techniques. The mythology surrounding McNamara and the opposition he faced exaggerated the difference his methods had made. The military had not dominated Eisenhower's budgetary process, nor had the civilians controlled Kennedy's as much as was claimed. Nonetheless, senior officers viewed with alarm the civilians who lacked combat experience yet pontificated on military tasks. The arrogance that the civilians had nurtured at Rand, never doubting their intellectual superiority over their military paymasters, had left resentments that were now aggravated as programs and budgets were put at risk. One tirade from a former chief of the Air Staff was joyously quoted in a book by two members of McNamara's staff against whom it was directed. General White complained about the, quote, pipe-smoking, tree-full of owls, end quote, types, doubting that these overconfident, sometimes arrogant young professors, mathematicians, and other theorists have sufficient worldliness or motivation to stand up to the sort of enemy we face, end quote. While Bull defended the new strategist against various charges of being uncritical, amoral, or pseudoscientific, he noted a conceit. Many were of the view that previously military affairs escaped scientific study and received only the haphazard attention of second-rate minds. He also noted an aspiration among the civilians to turn strategy into a science by eliminating antiquated methods and replacing them with up-to-date ones. If only, as some hoped, these new methods could get closer to economics, they could help rationalize our choices and increase our control over our environment. Brodie also doubted the exaggerated ambition, though White's comments confirmed the stereotype of a narrow-minded and prejudiced military. Brodie also found the new analysts and their methods a mixed blessing. They improved decision-making in the Pentagon on such matters as the procurement of new weapons, but there remained limits to what could be achieved by applying economics to strategy. Economists tend to be insensitive to and intolerant of political considerations that got in the way of their theories. More worrying than their weakness in diplomatic or military history and in contemporary politics was their lack of awareness of how, quote, how important a deficiency this is for strategic insight, end quote. The quality of the theoretical structures adopted by economists led to a disdain for other social sciences as primitive in their techniques and intellectually unworthy.